Hi, welcome to the Big Book Project. I'm your host, Lori Feathers, and today I'm so very pleased to have joining us Brad Costa. Brad is a fabulous reader, reads all the kind of books that I think a lot of the subscribers to the Big Book Project love and read. And on a more personal note, Brad is one of my sales representatives at my bookstore where he helps me kind of discriminately buy great books. And Brad works for Norton. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you so much for having me, Lori. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, as you know, we're talking about the kindly ones. I thought, as a little bit of just a background, you want to tell us kind of when you became acquainted or knew of this book, if you can remember, and then maybe what you were expecting and whether or not those expectations have kind of lived up to the hype.
Yeah, absolutely. So 2009, I was working in two different libraries. I was working at a small public library. And I was working in a very large academic library. And part of my job at the academic library, I was actually working in the archive, and we had a small Holocaust exhibit where, I'd get handed a box, and the box would be somebody's life. It would be the medals that they earned during World War One, and then slowly move to the Golden Star, and then death certificates. And I would just have to create finding guides, make sure that everything was being preserved properly. So 2009, the Holocaust was very much on my mind. So this was in the background. I didn't read it at the time. This is my first read of it. Um, but there was so much that I was learning about the Holocaust in that space, that I heard about it and it just kind of escaped my memory until you picked it for the Big Book Project. Um, so I'm really glad that you did, because now I've been able to jump into it. I love long books. I love really getting inside somebody's mind for 700 plus pages. I see you've got the Brief History of Seven Killings there on the background behind you. One of my favorite long books. Um, it's an interesting take. It's interesting to try to figure out what's the author and what the author wants you to think is Max, the memoirist. Even stuff like the kindly ones being a reference to Eumenides of Greek tragedy. Did Jonathan pick that, or is that something he thinks Max would have picked for the title of his own memoir? I find very interesting. And the more I read, the more I think that Max sees himself as this figure, this tragic hero, when we're reading it and we know he's very much not a tragic figure. He's somebody who's helping perpetuate these atrocities. So yeah, it's been interesting so far.
Yeah. I guess I'm curious. I didn't know about your background as like a museum archivist. How are you thinking about the historical background here and the depiction of, I think I've personally never read anything that's gotten into this much detail, although I'm sure there are nonfiction books out there that do this, into kind of the bureaucratic underpinnings and the logistical and procedural things that made this horrible Nazi war machine kind of function and operate. Although it's not always smooth, as we find out as we read.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Just knowing this stuff. I was working the library that I worked at had an archive that had several things in it. One of them was the Holocaust collection. They also had the Portuguese American archives for the United States. So I kind of flitted between those things. But knowing kind of the detail there, there's a few books that have really popped out while I've been reading this that I've thought about, that I read during that time to kind of get a better grasp on the material that I was working with. And one of them was The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kosinski, specifically the public's reaction to it. Because I agree, I don't think I've ever read anything in fiction that this detailed and this brutal, while also being this kind of cold and callous. Um, but Jerzy Kosinski in The Painted Bird, he was talking about a small gypsy boy living in Eastern Europe and his experiences during World War II. When it came out, all of Jersey's friends said, "This is great, but why did you pull your punches? You should have made it more brutal, because this is what we actually lived." So going from that, where it was kind of watered down, still very brutal, very, very difficult thing to read, to this, where he's really blowing that out and really making it more verbose and more disgusting. but he didn't survive it himself is kind of a weird juxtaposition as well, because Jonathan Littell was not alive during World War II. Um, it's been interesting, yeah. I don't know, but I agree that his sections of this are just so brutal that you want to put it down and bathe in the middle of the day just to shower off the bad feeling, and then jump right back into it. And next thing he's talking about how he's getting his coat tailored, and it's the back and forth is very cold.
Yeah, and I'm impressed with the detail. And the detail doesn't seem imagined in some cases. It seems like it must be based on some really hard research.
Yeah, and I did a little research on Jonathan Littell as well. Just I didn't want to jump into the plot, but I wanted to see a little bit more about him. And it looks like he read 200 books over 18 months while he was researching this before he spent 5 years writing it. And those 200 books were, field reports and novels and nonfiction. So I think a lot of what he's pulling is true to life, which makes it that much more horrific, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. So we're recording this, and it will be uh, posted, presumably, hopefully, the week of July 7th. And that takes us up to, I think, page 763 of the reading. And maybe we can just talk a little bit about what's been happening, up into today's or this week's reading. The I guess we, and I've been posting about it this week. We had this situation where Max is excited about this new position that he's gotten to kind of try to figure out how to increase labor production in the camps. And that all kind of seems to be, in his mind at least, and in the mind of a lot of experts, dependent upon it turns on whether or not they can get the diets of the prisoners in the concentration camps improved. And we kind of see this back and forth again, really a lot of detail, but kind of, I think, Max is part of the SS, and there's this whole political imperative, to exterminate the Jews. But then there's this practical imperative that they're facing as well with the military considerations, a little bit similar to what we saw in when Max was in the Caucasus, I think, where you know there's these theoretical issues about, like, oh, is that person really Jewish or Jewish enough to kill, or aren't they? And the military saying, well, we need these mountain Jews to kind of be on our side, or else it's going to be really more difficult for us. I also think in this week's section, we're starting to see more and more evidence that the war is starting to turn in a bad way for the Germans.
Yeah, very much so. And the whole section that you were describing, where he's trying to figure out exactly how many calories to feed people so they can be a good worker, to me really emphasizes this coldness of the book, because you do have these very vivid descriptions of the atrocities, and then you go back and just on paper he's jotting down numbers to say, well, if we feed them X amount of calories, then we can get the most production out of them, and trying to reduce humans to a number, which is obviously the whole point of this Holocaust. um, Really just shows his dehumanizing of people, while he's trying to say, he's always trying to justify his actions and say, I'm not a bad person, I was just, you would do the same in this. But his dehumanization really hits a level there that I haven't read in any other book, and I've never seen from another character in quite this way. The Zone of Interest, the film which just came out, kind of harkens to that, because it's brutally filmed. It's wonderful, incredible film, but it's just people living their lives when you hear all these atrocities happening just outside their gate, and they just go to bed at night with the crematorium fires in their window. Um, and it's that disconnect that lets people live this, and make them feel better about what they're doing. And it's very strange to try to get into the head of a character who's trying to do that while you know what he's doing is horrible.
Yeah, I think it was maybe last week's reading, that horrible scene where he's at the party. I think the commander's name is Haas, maybe. And the little boy is all dressed up in like English tweed clothing, kind of like pedaling his big wheel around this mansion in Poland. And, all of the clothes that he's wearing, the little boy doesn't know really any better, I guess. And he says, like, oh, yeah, my dad brought these home from the camps.
Yeah.
and then, and then all these people just kind of, you know, the, the 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 line about like how the human hair of all these prisoners was used for like stuffing pillows. And it's just it's kind of hard to imagine that, yeah, that I guess people just somehow triangulated in such a way that they could no longer see or feel the inhumanity of it.
Yeah. And then it also harkens back that scene where he's holding up the child at the party so he can get a view of the cake and everything. It harkens back to the kid that he picked up, that was trying to run away from being executed. And he said, "We'll take care of this one," and hands it back to what is the
uh
child's executioner. And just the
Yeah.
disparate between those, and realizing this is clothes from somebody that was in that exact same situation, is really stark.
Yeah, and then in that same scene with the little boy, the boy's father is so proud because he's come up with this idea to have this like human zoo where they will have, specimens, and that's the word he uses, specimens of all of these different peoples, including Jews, but others too, like gypsies that they've eradicated, but that for scientific research and anthropological reasons, they're going to let, uh, 15 or so of them survive so that they can, kind of live in these little Potomkin homes that are supposed to be, yeah, I don't know, like, you
And then
know,
even with the anthropological zoo, they're talking about, well, we need to keep this up so that people in the future will know why we had to exterminate these people because of these terrible lives they're living. Well, they're still talking about caging human beings. Um, yeah, it's it's really really wild. Um,
it is.
yeah.
It is. This question about, and it pervades through the whole book, how how um cold and just bereft and barren of a soul is Max as a character. In this week's reading, we get to a scene where they're hunting, and they're hunting for grouse, and he's with um, Spear, who I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but is some, even though there's a table in the back of all the rankings of the
Right.
Reichsfurs and Sturmmeisters and all. I don't know German, but I think that Spear is someone that's quite high up in the military, is what, if I can understand. He's not an SS guy, but
I believe
anyway,
so.
they're grouse hunting. Spears kind of surprised that Max doesn't intend to shoot, and Max makes the comment, "Well, I really don't like to kill unless it's out of duty." Again, kind of, I don't know. Does that? It does seem that Max doesn't really want to get his hands dirty for the most part in all
Yeah,
of this stuff, even though he's complicit as hell, right? But um and complicit isn't even right. I mean, he's an active participant in what's going on,
yeah,
but he just seems to prefer that someone else do the dirty work.
yeah. And I think that line to Spear, I read that as, I don't like to kill, well, unless it's my duty. It was almost him trying to cover his tracks on how he could say that, while obviously Spear knows what he does about Max. And that for me also raised the question of, is it is it better to be or is it worse, I guess, to be a true believer in the cause who's helping perpetuate this because you've bought the party line, you're all in? Or is it worse to be somebody who's indifferent but still helps because It's just kind of what's happening. So the people that are true believers, they have this moral imperative where they feel like they're doing right, even though we know what they're doing is wrong. They feel that they're doing right. Versus Max does have this back and forth with himself, so he says, where he's trying to feel out if he believes or not, but he's still executing thousands of people or perpetuating the execution of hundreds and thousands and millions of people. And which one of those is kind of worse? And I think that's one of the things that Littell is playing with here is who's the worst person, the Nazi who's standing up and waving the flag, or the person who's putting on the suit but feels bad about it but is still committing murder. That's tough.
Y- Yeah, and it is a fascinating question that you bring up, and also like how how true are the true believers? Like uh, are do they are they consciously aware that they're believers for political expediency or political gain? Um, I know that cults exist, but it's really kind of hard sometimes to think about some of these really highly educated people in this book and also in life, I guess, generally, that just, have fallen into line because they really, really, really do believe. It's a tough question, like you
Yeah,
said.
yeah. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting, and I don't know if we're ever going to get a straight answer from Max. Obviously, we've got 250-ish pages left, and I'm very excited to finish off the book and see where it goes. But all these things are kind of hanging in the balance right now, where you're not sure. Um, yeah, about the moral complicity of, or how he views the moral complicity of himself.
And this is a question that I've asked a couple of guests that I've had on, and we've talked about this book. What do you think about the whole narrative of Max's bizarre, weird, dysfunctional, and pretty sick personal life? The whole thing with his sister and his mother, and do you have thoughts as to why that stuff is even in this book?
Um, the thing with the sister really threw me off when I got there. When I got to the mother and the murder, I kind of assumed that was going to happen from early on in the book. Just the kindly ones being a reference to the Eumenides, who are the Furies who go out after people that have committed matricide, very specifically. Um, so I kind of saw that coming, and having this kind of, I'm not sure where the storyline with the twins is going, is also another part of it that I'm very interested to see where it goes. The part with the sister seems like he's almost blaming her for the way that his life has become, because he made these promises to her and she made the promises, but then she grew up and didn't keep them. So it seems like another way for him to kind of cast off guilt on another human being, because when he's talking about having romantic relationships with men or sexual relationships with men, he says, it's for the pleasure, but it's more for to get me closer to my sister. It's not what I want, it's what's needed for the situation. So it seems like another way he's just trying to cast off any issues that he has. It's not my fault, it's my sister's fault. And then when he meets somebody who seems like they might have a strong opinion, Helene, who we meet in this section, who seems like she might actually have some moral fiber, at least in a small way. It's interesting that he falls so in love with her, but says, "But I could never marry her." Even though you know that he ends up marrying down the road, because you hear that at the beginning of the book. It's very odd. I very much want to see what happened to the twins, and I think that's
Yeah,
going to answer a lot of questions for me.
yeah. I almost feel like the his his marriage that we read about in the prologue to the book, or the first section of the book, is almost a beard in two senses. It's like what we typically refer to as a beard, in terms of
Yeah.
like, yeah, he's a homosexual and wants to pretend like he's not, but also I kind of feel like it's also to kind of make him, to hide this former identity, to make him just seem like, oh, I'm the manager of a lace factory, and this is my respectable wife, and our, statistically correct, two children, and just to kind of, I guess, highlight that normalcy that he's trying to pull off now in civilian life after the war in France.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with that for sure. And yeah, it's interesting, specifically in this section where he's trying to make himself look like the good guy. And I think, again, harkening back to Greek tragedy, which I don't mean to keep doing, but it does seem like it runs a through line through this book. It was Plato who said, paraphrasing here, but um, it's good men. When good men fail to act is when we live under evil men. And I think he's still trying to perpetuate this line of, I'm a good guy. See, look I'm a good guy. I've got my wife and my kid and my job, and I've got a car, and I'm a successful human being now. So it was just the war that made me act this way. So I agree with what you're saying there with the beard, in both senses. The beard, I like that.
Yeah, yeah, and also, I mean, just the grotesque irony that he is working in lace after, like, having
Yeah,
his hands so bloodied in this just mass murder is just, yeah, it's something.
yeah.
What do you make of, Professor Mandelbrot and his, like, weird bevy of, I guess, fertile German women?
Right, his harem of women that are always hounding
Yes.
people. Um,
And all look alike and all start their names all start with an H. It's really
right.
creepy.
And I think that's done purposely, obviously, but I think he's trying to. Jonathan himself is trying to say with this, the rank and file at a certain point, everybody's going to look the same. Interesting fact: one of the members of ABBA was actually the child of this type of production. They were trying to produce good citizens for Nazi Germany. She was the child that was actually produced through a program to have more kids for Germany, and
Really?
ended up founding ABBA, which is pretty wild. Um, there's a lot of interesting word choices in here, is talking about the three women with the H names, which I think is great. And sorry, go off a little tangent here. It reminds me of when they're eating the hors d'oeuvres at a certain point. The word that Jonathan Littell uses at this party is they're digging into it. And kind of all of the terminology that he uses for eating all could also be used to imply work at a labor camp. Digging into the hors d'oeuvres was the one that really stuck out in my mind that I jotted down. But he's talking about this wealth of food that they're all devouring, in this really kind of sickening way when you realize just 40 pages beforehand he was figuring out exactly how many calories somebody needs to survive. It's
Yeah.
really disgusting, for lack of a better word. Yeah, just
Yeah. I also think it's really fascinating to, um, look at Max's friend Thomas and
the demon.
and and yes, and compare him a little bit to Voss. It's really hard to dislike Voss. He seemed like, you know, I don't know, maybe politically he wasn't a very nice person, but he did seem to have an academic rigor to him, in terms of, like, really wanting to not just be political about, like, oh, that person's Jewish, they need to go, and really unwilling to play this little game that they were playing about how they were going to determine who lives and who dies. But I do feel like Max felt quite close to Voss, and there are several times throughout the novel after Voss is dead that he says that he misses Voss. Um, and Voss and Thomas are such different cats. Do you have any thoughts on Thomas or the comparison with Voss, or what? Um, Thomas or Max says often that, like, he could never talk to Thomas about his personal life, but Thomas is like the first person that he goes to talk about, like, um, political stuff or professional stuff. But
uh,
I agree with you that Thomas is, I feel like, if there is a Satan in this book, it's Thomas.
oh yeah. And Thomas, I think Voss are the two sides of really how Max is viewing himself. It is the moral right and the moral wrong. And Thomas is obviously all those moral wrong things, but done in a cool, calculating, charismatic way where he can still talk to women and bring them into the club, and makes points that sound great until you dissect what he's actually saying and realize how horrific it is. In this section specifically, he lays out exactly why we hate the Jews as the Nazis, why we hate the Jews. And, Max is saying, I could never fall hook, line, and sinker into the party line like Thomas has. But he also agrees with him on a lot of these points. And Voss was kind of that opposite moral, where he's like trying to keep people alive in a very real way. He has that academic approach to it. But it seems like the split personality of Max is really displayed between those two characters. Unfortunately, because of that, Voss is dead. So we see Max going further and further onto this Thomas side, really that darker side. Um, Especially with some of the foreshadowing you see here. There's a line, I think it's obviously not intended as a throwaway line, but they're talking about Rudolf Haas and how he's the administrator of Auschwitz, but he's going to be replaced by Liebenschall. And shortly after that happens in real life, Haas goes back to Auschwitz and is responsible for the execution of 400,000 Hungarian Jews in only 50 days. So this is coming on the horizon, and you can see this darker skies approaching. It's obviously been dark the whole time, but it's getting darker and darker the further in you go, and he's getting further away from Voss and his own morality.
Yeah, it is interesting how Max seems to want to, I don't think it's a word, but academize like the evil, you
Yeah,
know? He kind of wants to find like theories or hard science or facts to kind of rationalize or justify all of this horrible stuff like he did in the Caucasus with the mountain Jews, like he's doing now or more recently with the diets of the people that are, that are going to be laborers until they are either, tapped to be executed or they, die because they just can't handle the burdens of the labor anymore. But yeah, he does seem to have a tendency to want to study things to death, and it seems like that might be kind of a security blanket for him because maybe he doesn't have to think really about the morality of what he's doing to such an extent, if he's just like making it an academic question.
yeah, and this part reminded me a lot of the novel *The Sea and the Poison* by Shisheki Endo, which is a fantastic Japanese novel. It's about Japanese soldiers during World War II that were vivisecting American prisoners of war, and essentially saying how much of a lung can we remove before they die. And the doctors have obviously a lot of internal struggles about dealing with this because they've taken the Hippocratic Oath. But at the end of the day, people are looking at it in this very cold academic light of, well, if we do this, then we can save so many more people. So we're doing this for this reason specifically, even though on the table they're literally just cutting somebody until they die. Um, it's a very striking scene, and then one of the characters ends up having a very long, very brutal, difficult life while he's coming to terms with the fact that he did this. But thinking about the figuring out exactly how many calories to make somebody a good worker and how you can give somebody else less calories because it's okay if they die, and thinking about the academic sense because then it's just numbers, it's not people. As Stalin said, if you kill one person it's a tragedy, if you kill a million it's a statistic. um, then trying to have that remove is really, really wild. And again, it gets more brutal the further in Max gets into the war. He becomes worse and worse of a person while trying to make himself seem like a better person. At the end of the day, he still thinks he's the good guy put in a difficult situation, and he doesn't realize that he's one of the people that's producing the difficult situation for everybody.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I found it especially harrowing that he seems to pretty quickly adopt the position on the caloric intake issue that, oh, well, seems clear that we just have to stop feeding the women and the children or just execute them, put them in the gas chamber immediately because, they're just taking up food, and they're not doing any labor in return. So we have to be able to reallocate their calories to laborers, basically.
Yeah, and that scene a few weeks ago, I believe, where he's talking to Honeyegg and he said, "Oh, we don't have women and children," and just the realizing what that means implicitly is so dark and just a very casual way to say you're executing all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very strong writing. And then
Yeah.
in comparison, you've got the bombing of Berlin, where the zoo is on fire, and you have one of the characters say, "Oh, the poor beasts, we can hear them crying." So they're more worried about these animals in a zoo than they are about human beings that they're doing this to on a systematic basis. It's very stark.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess, just on a personal level, are there times that you kind of feel like you have to put this book down, like you can't read anymore?
Oh, very much so. But you get to a scene and it's just absolutely soul crushing. My wife's made a comment. She always can tell when I'm reading a very difficult book because I'll just stand up, put it down, and say, "All right, I need to get a shower." um, I was reading during the COVID lockdowns. I was reading the Kalima stories, which is another book that really popped out for me here by Varlam Shalamov. He survived 17 years in the Kalima Gulag, which is the longest that we know of anybody that lived there. Um, but he's writing in very graphic terms about the living conditions. At one point, he said, "When you take off your sweater, you can't put it on the ground because there's so much lice, it'll literally walk away from you and you'll lose it." Or talking about people with tuberculosis having other prisoners want them to spit in their mouths so that they can also get sick for a little bit. And it's one of those, okay, well, I need to go scrub my skin off for a few minutes and then. But his writing style makes me want to jump back in, as it did with Shalamov. I want to see where this story is going at the end of the day.
Yeah. I do think that the book is well written, not just from a pacing standpoint, but some of the descriptions of the landscape are quite lovely, and that also is jarring and discomforting, right? Because at one point Max will be talking about beautiful sunrise in a bucolic setting in the hills of Galatia, and the next minute he's talking about, like, you know trying to, like, shove people in trenches after they're shot, and so they don't get back up again.
Yeah, it's
It's
atmospheric in the good way and in a very horrific way at the same time. But he's done a wonderful job with the wording here. There are a few more things that I wrote down. There's one character who said that when they're at the party before they go on the hunt, they're talking about how exhausted this SS official is, and they said, "Well, he so needs rest." And thinking about, again, the people that he's forcing into hard labor conditions, and this is the person that when they go to visit the concentration camp, Spear is absolutely disgusted with the results of what's going on there. But he just, the person who's perpetuating this needs rest. It was very interesting. And there's this section, if you don't mind, I'd like to read. It's kind of a long section, but I think it really hits home here. Um, and this is when Max is talking about wishing he was a true believer. He's just talked about how Eichmann's a true believer and he wishes he could be like that. And he says, "My misfortune perhaps came from the fact that they had assigned me to tasks that did not correspond to my natural inclination. Ever since Russia, already, I felt out of place, capable of doing what was asked of me, but as if I were limited in terms of initiative, for I indeed studied these tasks, first police-related, then economic, and mastered them, but I hadn't yet succeeded in convincing myself of their rightness. I couldn't manage to fully grasp the profound necessity that guided them, and so find my path with precision and sureness of a sleepwalker, as did the Fuhrer and so many of my colleagues and comrades who were more gifted than I. Could there have been another realm of activity that might have agreed with me better, where I would have felt more at home? There might have been, but it's hard to say, for it didn't happen, and in the end, the only thing that counts is what was, and not what could have been." I feel like that really hits home too, where he's like, "Well, I could have been a true believer, but I wasn't, so therefore I'm not this bad person, even though I was doing what I could have. I could have been better for the cause if they'd assigned me to something I actually cared about, even though he is perpetuating this thing. He's still talking about genocide." And that brought me to Kurt Vonnegut with Mother Night. We are what we pretend to be, so therefore must be very careful of what we pretend to be. Just because you think you're a good person, but you're acting horribly, that makes you a horrible person. Which also goes back to Greek tragedy, that's actus reus, which is the Greeks believed you were guilty of the act without real intent. If you did a thing, you were guilty of it, regardless of how you felt about it, which I think again ties into this Greek tragic hero, the metaphor, the motif and metaphor that I really enjoy.
Yeah, and Max does go into a rather long discourse, I guess, in his mind or in his writing, since this is ostensibly a memoir that we're reading, written by Max, of the difference between kind of Western law and the way that the Greeks looked at fate and responsibility and that kind of thing. I thought that was quite an interesting section of the book as well.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely hit home, and it reminded me also of Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman, which is another one of the great World War II novels. Everybody wants to throw fate into the title of their World War II book.
Yeah. I love that book too. And I actually, did you try or did you read Stalingrad?
I read both, yeah. I read them back to back.
I just felt like Stalingrad, this is an aside, but I just felt Stalingrad was a much lesser novel because it felt a little bit like he was allowing himself to be censored more.
Yeah, I agree. And that scene in Life and Fate where one of the characters is trying to smother a child while they're both in the gas chamber together would not have occurred in Stalingrad because it was very much for the Russian state. I produced it this way versus Life and Fate was very cutting.
Yeah,
I agree.
yeah, yeah. Um, I guess as we're looking, approaching ever so slowly, I guess, but we'll be there in a couple 3 weeks, I guess. The end of the book, I guess, in thinking about what questions might be resolved and what those that might not be, there's of course, the whole issue um, with Max's sister and and the twins and what that is all about. Um, I I personally am not really expecting a redemptive arc here for this character. I feel like um, he kind of shows us by the beginning of the book, which is set in the present time, uh, as like a prelude to the memoir of the World War II days, that we're this guy's pretty unrepentant, insistent that he's no worse than you or I, um, and that you know people like him who were just kind of doing what they were told, um, really aren't aren't more guilty than anyone else. But are there things that you're looking to see how they end up or resolve in the book?
Yeah, I agree with you about the redemptive arc. I don't think it's going to happen, especially because I don't think Max thinks he needs to have a redemptive arc. That's what he's been justifying this whole time. I would like to see him come to terms with the fact that he murdered his mother and stepfather. I'd like to have that shoe kind of fall because right now it happened in a blackout and he doesn't quite remember it. Um, but I think he's going to have that moment again because it's called the Kindly Ones. I think that he's going to have that matricidal um, realization. I really want to see what happens with the twins and his sister. I've got some thoughts as where that's going to go, but I won't share that here. I'd like to see how it plays out. I really want to see what happens with Thomas because he has been this negative guiding figure and has been this presence everywhere that Max goes. Thomas shows up and has justifications for horrible things, and I really want to see how that plays out as we get closer and closer to Operation Haas, which is the Hungarian Jews being executed over 56 days. And as we get closer and closer to what I'm assuming is going to be the Battle of Berlin, where this all winds up, with the actual fall of the Third Reich, I want to see how Thomas plays a part in all of that, and if he tries to justify again at the end, or if he kind of comes to terms with, this is over. I really want to see what happens with Thomas. I'm very interested there.
Yeah, I can't help but have a really burning desire to see the smugness get wiped from Thomas.
Yeah,
He's kind of a despicable character. He's always just well, it's hard to know whether he's playing up this kind of role or whether he really is just like this kind of obstinately optimistic about like how the war is going and that they're going to be victorious, and all of his kind of hectoring at Max. Oh, you think too much, you worry too much. I would, I guess I wouldn't be so sad to see him like have a horrible death, or at least
right.
kind of go insane at the end, because he's been playing this like either playing or being a total ostrich about like reality all around him, right? It's just like not willing to see the writing on the wall kind of thing.
Yeah, does he actually believe everything's going well, or is he only saying that because as a bureaucrat he has to justify what he's doing and say it's going well? At the heart of bureaucracy, there is no heart. So yeah, I'm interested to see. I'd like to see his death on screen, as they say, just because he's been such a horrible person. I feel like there'd be a little bit of a justice there for all of us readers.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned Life and Fate. Are there other and the Endo book, which I think I need to look at that, because it sounds quite brutal, but I loved Endo's Silence. I
Oh
read
yeah.
the book and saw the movie, of course, and I think both are exquisite. But are there other since you're such a well-read gentleman, are there other books or things that they don't necessarily have to be about World War II, but just uh, kind of have a resonance in, in some way or fashion for you
Oh
to this?
yeah. A few of them I mentioned. The Sea and the Poison, obviously. The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kosinski, and the Kalima stories by Varlam Shalamov. Um, the other one that's been sticking out, another very notable, very very long book, is Anniversaries by U.A. Johnson, which is wonderful. It's like 2,500 pages. It's a very very long read, but it's a woman who's talking about. He wrote a chapter for every day starting in 1967 to 1968. And part of the book is the headlines from the New York Times, what's going on every single day. And the other part of it is this woman describing her family and how they survived both Nazi Germany and then the Russian takeover. And some of the descriptions that UA Johnson uses in that also feel akin to what Max is describing here. Obviously, not as brutal. Like I said, this is an incredibly brutal book, but kind of that bureaucratic numbers game that makes this so cold, I think are really well established there. And then Mother Night by Kurt Vonnegut is one of the greatest World War II novels ever written about moral complicity. And Zone of Interest, I haven't read the book yet, which shame on me because I love Martin Amis and I should. But the movie was just startling. And I also watched it last week, so it's very, very much in my mind right now. And I think it will be for years to come.
Yeah, I can recommend the book. The book is very
Yeah.
good, and you know, Martin Amis had quite an interest in communism and Stalinism in particular, because his father uh, was a professed communist for a while, and they used to get into arguments about communism generally. But there's also another book by Martin Amis, House of Meetings, that takes place in a Stalin gulag, which is quite interesting as well. But Zone of Interest is quite good. That's interesting what you're saying about the Hugh Johnson book Anniversaries, which NYRB brought out, I guess, what 6 years ago or so, in a
About there, yeah.
2 volume. like slipcase um, edition. I thought that, I guess based on the years where the entries are taking place, that would be that it was a lot of Vietnam War.
So it's some Vietnam, but actually a lot of it's Eastern Bloc, Russian takeover. The 1 year day, so the last chapter is when Prague Spring officially ended because the Russian troops rolled in to Prague. But there's so much of it where she's describing her family's story to her daughter. So they're talking about the whole family kind of bouncing from Nazism to communism and being subjugated to atrocities under both before she escapes and makes it to New York City, and then raises her child in New York City. So it does touch on kind of all of the pieces, which you can do when you've got 2,500 pages to work with. You can touch on a lot. Um,
Yeah.
but he does touch a lot on World War II, and really the takeover that you're kind of seeing happen right now as they're slowly losing cities in the Eastern Bloc from the Nazis to Stalin, and seeing a different way that horrors are being perpetuated. Even right here, it's just kind of theoretical because they're not positive that it's happening behind the ever moving Iron Curtain. Um, but you can see it very, very starkly in anniversaries, just right next to each other. It's a beautiful book. It's a lot to take on, but it's very much worth it in my opinion.
Maybe it'll be a future big book project.
Maybe.
Uh, yeah, I just, of course, we know through popular culture that this is the way it went, right? But it's still astounding to read such a detailed account of all of these Germans just kind of drinking and eating well and laughing and going to swimming pools and black grouse hunting, while Rome is like quite literally burning,
Yeah.
like either getting bombed all over the place, and Thomas is, you know, basically sitting in an office that's all around him, there's nothing but ashes, and he's drinking schnapps and mucking it up with like some of his fellow officers. It's the hubris and the conceit involved. It's it's stunning no matter how often you're exposed to it, I think.
Yeah. And even there's a line during that scene during the bombing of Berlin where one of the characters said, "Well, thank God they're bombing Berlin. They're only killing humans. Before they were bombing our ball bearings, and if they do that, we lose the war." So the fact that you've dehumanized one group makes it so much easier to dehumanize another, even if it's your neighbors. It's like, oh, well, it's fine. We're just losing people. As long as we're not losing this small little intricate piece that we need to perpetuate the war, it's fine.
Yeah,
It's very, yeah. And again, then going out and drinking cognac until he blacks out and wakes up at a hotel. It's
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It's messed up.
yeah,
Um, well, Brad, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so happy that you decided to read this with us. It was a special thrill for me when you told me that you were gonna pick it up and read it with us, because I know that you're a great reader, and have read widely and deeply a lot of different things, and I was excited just to see whether or not, you know and you don't we can reserve judgment until the end, but whether or not you thought this book lived up to a book that really deserves readers. And although it has a quite a I think a divisive critical reception, um I when I read it the first time back in 2009, I thought that there was something there that deserved readers. And I still think that.
yeah. And I hate to think that books that the only books we should read aren't the books that don't challenge us. We should read books that challenge us. And if it's something that is this dark, gritty thing, as long as there's kind of a payoff, even if it's just dealing with this moral ambiguity and seeing how we feel about it, I think it's very important to read texts that get us out of our comfort zone. So thank
Yeah,
you for picking this. I think this is a wonderful book for the selection. Again, we'll reserve judgment for the end about how I feel about it completely. But as of right now, I'm enthralled, and looking forward to the next 3 weeks.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
okay to be uncomfortable when you read.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. All
All
right.
right, Brad. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Laurie.